Something has shifted in the Middle East, and it did not happen with a declaration. It did not happen with a summit. It happened quietly, strategically, and with devastating precision, and most of the world is still processing what it means. The United Arab Emirates, one of the wealthiest, most calculated, and most diplomatically cautious nations in the entire Gulf region, has been secretly conducting military strikes against Iran. Not in retaliation for some abstract geopolitical threat, not as a symbolic gesture of solidarity. In direct response to Iranian attacks on their own energy infrastructure, real strikes, real targets, real consequences. Let that settle for a moment. This is not a country known for military adventurism. This is not a nation that historically puts its forces in harm's way without extraordinarily careful calculation. The UAE does not act impulsively. When the UAE decides to strike, it is because the calculus has already been run, the risks have been weighed, and the conclusion is clear. Doing nothing is now more dangerous than going to war. That is the signal the world needs to understand right now. Not the diplomacy, not the press conferences, not the negotiating language coming out of Tehran. The signal is this. A Gulf Arab state has made a strategic decision that Iran is a greater threat to its survival than the consequences of open military confrontation. And it acted on that decision in secret, with precision, and in coordination with a broader coalition that is actively reshaping the power structure of the entire Middle East. That is where we are today, and it is far more serious than the headlines suggest. Let me walk you through what is actually happening, because the pieces of this story need to be understood together, not in isolation, not through the lens of any single news cycle, but as a connected strategic reality that is unfolding in real time. Start with Iran's position. For decades, the Islamic Republic built its regional strategy around a simple concept: survivability through proxy power. If you cannot be everywhere yourself, you arm, fund, and direct groups who fight on your behalf. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, militias across Iraq and Syria. The logic was elegant and effective. Create so many pressure points across the region that no single adversary could neutralize the threat without triggering a catastrophic chain reaction. For years, that strategy worked. It worked because the regional powers were fragmented, because the Gulf states distrusted each other almost as much as they distrusted Iran, because the United States oscillated between engagement and withdrawal, because Israel was seen as a separate problem, not a potential partner, because no one wanted to pay the price of confronting Tehran directly. That calculus has now collapsed. And the collapse did not happen because of any single event. It happened because Iran made a series of strategic miscalculations that forced the very countries it was trying to intimidate into a corner. And when you corner a wealthy, capable, and increasingly desperate nation, you should not be surprised when it starts fighting back. The UAE's decision to conduct strikes against Iran is not the beginning of the story. It is the consequence of a longer story that Tehran refused to read correctly. When Iran targeted energy infrastructure in Gulf Arab states, infrastructure that represents not just economic revenue, but existential stability for governments whose entire social contract with their populations is built on prosperity, it crossed a line that those governments could not ignore. This was not a warning shot. This was not a demonstration of capability designed to signal resolve. This was an attack on the foundations of how these states function. And the response from the UAE was not a plea for diplomacy. It was not an appeal to international institutions. It was not a phone call to Tehran asking for de-escalation. The UAE asked the United States for targeting information. They wanted to know where to strike. They joined the coalition not as passengers, but as active participants, with their own grievances, their own strategic interests, and their own willingness to absorb the risk of being at war with Iran. That is a transformation in Gulf Arab strategic culture that will outlast this specific conflict by decades. Think about what this means geopolitically. For years, Israel and the Gulf Arab states existed in a kind of strategic parallel, aligned in their fear of Iran, but separated by the Palestinian issue, by domestic politics, by the enormous weight of Arab public opinion that made open normalization with Israel politically dangerous for Gulf leaders. The Abraham Accords changed the diplomatic architecture. But what is happening now is changing something deeper. The actual security relationship, the willingness to fight alongside each other, the recognition that the threat is the same and the solution requires coordination. Israel has reportedly sent Iron Dome batteries and personnel to help protect the UAE. Let that sink in. Israeli air defense systems protecting Emirati territory. Iranian missiles creating the conditions for Israeli-Emirati military cooperation that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. This is what strategic miscalculation at the highest level looks like. Iran did not just attack energy infrastructure. Iran accelerated the very alliance it feared most. Now add Kuwait to this picture. Kuwait, a country that has historically tried to maintain careful neutrality in the region, a country that shares a border with Iraq and has always been acutely aware of its own vulnerability. Kuwait just captured IRGC operatives attempting to infiltrate its territory by boat, members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, on Kuwaiti soil, 2 days after Kuwait shot down Iranian drones flying overhead. This is not a border incident. This is not a misunderstanding. This is Iran probing the defenses of a Gulf Arab state while simultaneously engaged in ceasefire negotiations with the United States. This is the Iranian regime doing two things at once: talking peace at the negotiating table while running operations designed to demonstrate that they can still project threat into the territories of their neighbors. The problem with that dual strategy, and it is a serious strategic problem for Tehran, is that it does not intimidate. Not anymore. It unifies. Every act of Iranian aggression against a Gulf Arab state in this environment does not make those states more cautious. It makes them more committed to the coalition. It gives their leaders domestic justification for policies that their populations might otherwise question. It transforms abstract threat perception into concrete, lived experience. Kuwait is now making choices about which side of this confrontation it stands on, and the evidence suggests it is not choosing Iran. Now let us talk about the ceasefire, because the language coming out of Washington tells you everything you need to know about where this is heading. President Trump described Iran's response to the American peace proposal as, and I am quoting here directly, a piece of garbage. He said he did not even finish reading it. He called the ceasefire on life support. These are not diplomatic phrases. These are not calculated understatements designed to create negotiating room. This is the language of a leader who has concluded that the other side is not negotiating in good faith, and who is openly signaling that the military option remains on the table. Iran's parliament speaker responded with threats. Their foreign ministry called their own proposals reasonable demands, responsible proposals, and generous suggestions. There is a fundamental disconnect here, and it is not a misunderstanding that more negotiating rounds will resolve. Here is what analysts who study these dynamics understand that the headlines often miss: the gap between what Iran says it agreed to and what it actually committed to in writing is not a clerical error. It is a pattern. Iran has a long history of making verbal commitments in high-pressure situations and then walking back those commitments when the pressure temporarily eases. The Trump administration has identified this pattern, and the response, calling the proposal garbage, calling the ceasefire life support, openly discussing the resumption of military operations, is designed to communicate that this time the pattern will not be tolerated. The Wall Street Journal editorial board has argued that Iran believes Trump is bluffing, that Iran's leadership has looked at the American political environment, the opposition, the media criticism, the economic pressures, the complexity of managing multiple global crises simultaneously, and concluded that the United States will eventually blink. That is a dangerous calculation, and here is why. There is a strategic logic to what the Trump administration has been doing that is easy to miss if you focus only on the day-to-day diplomatic exchanges. Project Freedom, the operation to escort commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz, to physically demonstrate that Iran's ability to use the Strait as a weapon of economic coercion was not absolute, was suspended. Trump paused it. And the conventional interpretation was that this was a concession, a sign of retreat, an acknowledgement that the political cost of maintaining the operation was too high. But consider another interpretation. Consider the possibility that the pause was not for Iran's benefit. It was for the world's benefit. It was designed to demonstrate to China, to Europe, to the broader international community that the United States gave Iran every possible opportunity to come to the table in good faith before resuming military pressure. It was about the legitimacy of what comes next. Because if negotiations collapse, and the signals right now suggest they are on the edge of collapse, the next phase of military operations will not begin as an act of American aggression. It will begin as the inevitable consequence of Iranian intransigence. The diplomatic record will show that Iran was offered terms, that Iran rejected those terms, that Iran continued to conduct operations against Gulf Arab states during the ceasefire period, that Iran's response to a serious peace proposal was described by the American president as garbage. That record matters. It matters for coalition cohesion. It matters for international legitimacy. And it matters for the domestic politics of every leader whose country is involved in this confrontation. Trump did not pause Project Freedom because he was backing down. He paused it to make the next move unambiguous. Now I want to bring in a dimension of this conflict that does not receive nearly enough attention: Russia's role and what it tells us about the actual architecture of the global confrontation that is taking place here. Reports indicate that Russia was providing Iran with satellite coordinates, the targeting data that enabled Iranian strikes on American military bases. 220 separate strikes on American positions. That is not a footnote. That is a direct act of hostile intelligence cooperation between Russia and a state that is actively at war with a U.S.-backed coalition. Vladimir Putin has made no secret of his strategic objective. The United States must no longer be the dominant power in the global order. He has pursued that objective in Ukraine. He pursued it through disinformation campaigns. And now, in the Middle East, Russia is providing targeting data to a regime that is directly confronting American military power. This is the actual axis that the world needs to understand. It is not just Iran against America. It is a constellation of adversarial interests: Russia, China, Iran, each pursuing their own specific objectives, but aligned in their desire to see American strategic power diminished. Russia provides targeting data. China buys Iranian oil, providing the revenue that keeps the regime financially viable. Iran provides the actual military confrontation that ties down American resources and attention. These three actors do not need a formal alliance to function as a strategic bloc. They need shared interests, and right now they have them. Which brings me to something that very few analysts are connecting clearly enough. Trump's visit to China is not separate from the Iran crisis. It is inseparable from it. China was purchasing approximately 90% of Iran's oil exports. 90%. That is not a commercial relationship. That is a strategic lifeline. Without Chinese purchases, Iran's economy does not just suffer, it collapses. The revenue that funds the IRGC, that pays for the proxy networks, that keeps the nuclear program operational, that allows the regime to survive under sanctions, a decisive portion of that revenue flows through Chinese oil purchases. The disruption of the Strait of Hormuz, the ongoing uncertainty about whether commercial shipping can move safely through those waters, is not just a problem for global energy markets, it is a direct economic problem for China. China's manufacturing economy runs on energy. Its data centers run on energy. Its transportation infrastructure runs on energy. And when that energy supply is threatened, when oil prices spike, when shipping routes become militarily contested, China pays a price. So when Trump sits down with Chinese leadership in Beijing, Iran will be on the table. Not explicitly, perhaps, not in the formal agenda, but it will be there. Because China understands that its ability to secure favorable trade terms with the United States, its ability to get concessions on tariffs and technology, its ability to navigate the bilateral economic relationship on terms that don't cripple its own growth. All of that is complicated by the fact that China is economically sustaining a regime that is at war with a U.S.-led coalition. Trump does not need to threaten China directly. The leverage is structural. China needs Iranian oil. China also needs American markets, American technology, and relief from the tariff regime that has been squeezing its export economy. These two needs are now in direct tension, and the person sitting across the table from Chinese leadership is the same person who just called an Iranian peace proposal garbage and put a ceasefire on life support. That is not a coincidence. That is a negotiating position. Let me address something directly, because it is the question that sits underneath all of this analysis. Can negotiations still succeed? Is there a path to a deal? The honest answer is, the path is narrow, and it is getting narrower by the day. The core issue is not sanctions. It is not the details of diplomatic language. It is not even the ceasefire terms. The core issue is nuclear weapons. The American position, and it has been stated clearly, repeatedly, and without ambiguity, is that Iran cannot have a pathway to a nuclear bomb. Not a reduced pathway, not a delayed pathway, not a monitored pathway with periodic inspections. No pathway. Iran's position has been that its nuclear rights are a matter of national sovereignty and non-negotiable. Their parliament speaker, in language that Washington characterized as belonging to the moderate faction, insisted that Iran's nuclear rights, as laid out in a 14-point proposal, must be accepted as the starting point, not as an outcome to be negotiated, as a precondition. These two positions are not the opening bids of a negotiation that can find a middle ground. They are fundamental disagreements about what the negotiation is even for. And here is the strategic danger in that gap. If Iran genuinely believes that Trump will eventually accept a face-saving deal that leaves their nuclear program essentially intact, they will keep playing for time. They will make small concessions on peripheral issues while protecting the core. They will accept ceasefire terms and violate them at the margins. They will submit proposals that are deliberately inadequate, wait for the American response, and use the interval to continue whatever activities they need to continue. Iran has studied the North Korean model. Develop overwhelming conventional capability and nuclear ambiguity simultaneously, so that no adversary can prevent you from crossing the nuclear threshold without paying an unacceptable price. That model almost worked. It required a president willing to call the strategy out by name and respond to it with actual military force, not threats, not sanctions, not diplomatic frameworks. Military force that eliminated 70 to 75% of Iran's key military infrastructure in 6 weeks. 25% remains. And the question hanging over every conversation, every diplomatic exchange, every carefully worded ceasefire proposal is what happens to that 25%. There is also an element of this crisis that speaks to the long-term transformation of the Middle East that is occurring right now. a transformation that will extend far beyond the outcome of this specific confrontation. The Gulf Arab states are making a generational choice. They are looking at the landscape and asking a simple question: who is the greater threat to our survival? And for the first time in modern history, the answer is becoming clear enough to act on. Iran is the country that attacked their energy infrastructure. Iran is the country whose operatives were captured infiltrating Kuwait by boat. Iran is the country whose drones were shot down over Gulf Arab territory. Iran is the country that has spent decades funding proxy groups designed to destabilize Gulf governments and inflame regional populations against their own leaders. Israel, by contrast, sent Iron Dome batteries. Israel's military technology is now protecting Emirati skies. The strategic logic of the Abraham Accords, the idea that Arab states and Israel share more interests than they have conflicts, is being validated not by diplomatic language, but by the actual realities of regional security. This is rewriting the threat map of the Middle East, not slowly, not gradually. Right now, in real time, under the pressure of an active military confrontation that is forcing every regional actor to declare, through their actions, which side of the line they stand on. Iran's strategic position, encirclement of Israel, proxy dominance from the Mediterranean to the Gulf, the slow accumulation of nuclear capability as the ultimate guarantee of regime survival, that strategy required regional ambiguity. It required Gulf states to hedge. It required the United States to remain cautious. It required Israel to be isolated. None of those conditions exist anymore. Here is what I want you to understand as we step back and look at this moment in full. What is unfolding in the Middle East right now is not a regional crisis that will resolve itself with a ceasefire and return to the previous equilibrium. There is no previous equilibrium to return to. The UAE has conducted secret military strikes on Iranian territory. Kuwait has shot down Iranian drones and captured IRGC operatives. Israel has deployed air defense systems in an Arab Gulf state. A U.S.-led coalition has destroyed 3/4 of Iran's key military infrastructure. Russia has been caught providing targeting data to Iran against American forces. China is watching its economic lifeline through Iranian oil become a liability in its most important bilateral relationship. These are not isolated events. They are the symptoms of a structural transformation in the global order. A transformation that has been building for years and is now accelerating toward a resolution that will be determined not by the most eloquent negotiating text, but by the willingness of the parties involved to absorb risk and pay real costs. Iran's leadership faces a choice that their ideology makes almost impossible to make rationally: accept terms that functionally end their nuclear ambitions, or face a coalition that has already demonstrated its willingness and capability to strike with devastating effect, and that is growing, not shrinking, in size and commitment. The ceasefire is on life support. The latest Iranian proposal has been called garbage. The UAE is at war. Kuwait is under attack, and Trump is flying to Beijing, carrying leverage that China cannot afford to ignore. The margin for error in this situation is not wide. The next miscalculation, by Tehran, by any of the actors in this coalition, or by the parties trying to negotiate a way out, could tip this from a crisis that is still technically in the diplomatic phase into something far more consequential. And the world needs to understand that clearly, not because panic serves anyone, but because in geopolitics the most dangerous moments are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes the most dangerous moment is the one where every party has already made their decision, where the positions are locked, where the path to de-escalation requires someone to accept something they have publicly declared they will never accept. And the only question left is which direction the pressure breaks. We are close to that moment. Closer than the diplomatic language suggests. Closer than the ceasefire terminology implies, closer than most of the coverage of this crisis is willing to say directly. I am saying it directly, because that is what this situation requires. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what is actually at stake in this moment, not the version filtered through political noise, but the real strategic picture, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. I'm Dr. Margaret Sullivan, and this is what I do. I cut through the surface, follow the pressure points, and tell you what the movement of governments, militaries, and economic powers actually means before the consequences become obvious to everyone else. If that matters to you, subscribe, hit the notification bell, because the next development in this crisis will not wait, and neither will I. And I want to hear from you. What do you think happens next? Does Iran come back to the table with something serious? Or does this ceasefire collapse entirely? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The conversation that happens down there is often just as sharp as anything I say on camera. I'll see you in the next one.